Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and how great it is to have as our guest Dr. Mark Thornton. Mark is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute, does many things, writes books, Economics of Prohibition, for example, co-authors books, edits books. He helps with the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics as its book review editor. Most recently, he's become the head of our new Economic Crisis Project to try to make sure that the Institute is ready. As we know, there's going to be another crisis. Maybe the crisis has never gone away. Maybe we'll say the current crisis intensifies, that we're ready with the answers, the explanations the people need to hear. And it's not just Paul Krugmania. So, Mark, tell us about, first of all, this Economic Crisis Project before we go on to some other matters.
Hello, Lou. It's great to be with you. Well, as Austrian economists, we know that when the Federal Reserve is active in the financial industry, to the extent that it's active today, increasing the monetary base in the economy, reducing interest rates to zero, paying interest on excess bank reserves, that there's trouble ahead in the economy, that they're papering over the correction process that Austrians would like to see take place, throwing a lot of inflationary fuel into the banking system and creating bubbles. They're creating bubbles in bond markets. They're creating high prices in commodity markets. And so they're having a very disruptive effect on the economy. They're disrupting markets. They're disrupting the recovery process. And as a result, I think we need to keep an eye on what they're doing and be ready to respond once these markets break down from all the pressure that the Fed is creating in the financial markets.
Mark, have they created another housing bubble, or at least in some parts of the country?
Well, they certainly explicitly, part of their policy options is they wanted to prevent the housing bubble from completely recovering, from completely going down to a sustainable level and then recovering. So they've prevented the correction process in housing markets in many places. And now we see that the housing prices are actually rising in markets around the economy as a result of the ridiculously low interest rates. I mean, if you can get a 30-year mortgage for 3.5% denominated in U.S. dollars, it's hard to say no to something like that. And so we see real estate market bubbles really in where the money is being injected in the economy, which is Washington, D.C., with all-time high real estate prices, and in Manhattan, which now has all-time high real estate prices and leasing rates. And so they're definitely having an effect. And it's not surprising, not the least bit surprising, with keeping foreclosures off of the market and then buying up all the bonds that are created by Fannie and Freddie, all the paper that they're generating in real estate market. The Fed is basically the only buyer of all that stuff. So they're doing everything that they can possibly do. Well, I've said that before, and then they've gone even further. So there's no stopping this runaway Fed and what they're doing to markets and what the distortions they're causing and the fact that they're preventing the correction process in the overall economy.
Mark, you famously predicted the end of the last bubble while everybody, or most everybody else, was saying happy times are here for good. Do you want to tell us what you're seeing right now?
Well, I remember that well. It was February 9th, 2004. It's an article I published on LewRockwell.com saying that there was a housing bubble and that it's continuing up and that eventually it's going to crash and it's not going to be good for the economy or financial markets or unemployment. And that's exactly what we saw. And it made me a very unlikable person, basically. People did not like to hear that there was a housing bubble. Everybody else was saying you can't lose money in real estate, that housing prices never go down. And
there's only so much land.
Yeah, that's right. There's only so much land. There's all sorts of, excuses. People didn't want to see the reality of what the Fed was doing because, of course, it had reduced interest rates on federal funds down to 1%. Mortgage rates were 5%, and they were getting crazy. I mean, that was one of the symptoms of a bubble, is that people start trying to find any way to get rid of that money created by the Federal Reserve. So you could get 100% financing, in some cases 110% financing, yes, with teaser rates, with all sorts of nonsense that would never go on in a free market banking system. And so those were all clear signs that reinforced my belief that there was a housing bubble. I recently wrote an article about Norway's housing bubble because housing prices in Norway are at all-time record highs. I mean, they're just completely out of line with reality. And that's true in many other countries, too, where in Switzerland, Sweden, these are places where, of course, the Europeans are inflating the euro, and people are trying to flee out of things like the euro and out of things like the U.S. dollar and into things like real estate and gold. And so those real estate markets in Northern Europe are seeing bubble conditions and seeing a lot of the financial chicanery with their local Freddie Macs and Fannie Maes and 100% financing, teaser rates, things of that nature. So, yeah, there's housing bubbles still going on in the world as a result of all the central bank inflation.
Mark, you've also recently written about the fascinating fact that central banks are in Germany and other countries are wanting their gold back from the Fed and from the Bank of England too. That vast amounts of their gold are stored there. The Fed finds this very destabilizing. So does the media. It's something terrible. Why are they doing it? But of course, the question is, and as you've pointed out, the Fed says, "Well, we'll pay you back. We'll let you have some of your gold back in 7 years." So does that mean that is it just they're afraid of the destabilizing fact that people are wanting gold, that they're discussing gold? And also, of course, these represents political movements because the German government doesn't want to do this. It's just vast political demand. And in Germany, people want to know, well, why the heck is the gold in New York? So what's going to happen there, do you think?
Well, it is a popular movement in Germany. Germany is seen as the bailout country, seen as what used to be the soundest currency. The euro doesn't look so good right now, and the German people know that there's trouble ahead, basically. And so when they found out that most of their gold was being held outside the country, in London and in Paris and in New York, there was some outrage, and the German government responded by requesting an audit of their gold holdings in New York, which the Federal Reserve denied.
Yeah.
And so they made a formal request for 300 tons of their gold to be returned to Germany. They'd still have roughly 1,000 tons left in New York, so it's not like they're moving everything out. They're moving all of their gold out of the Bank of Paris, but that's a smaller amount. So they want their gold back. They've gotten some of their gold back from London, and so they're moving it back, trying to calm fears of the German population. The gold was in New York because of Cold War concerns that the Russians would come in and steal it. And so it was placed there out of fear. Well, now the fear is not the Soviet Union, but the United States. And so they're bringing the gold back. The odd thing, though, is that the gold doesn't all come back until the year 2020, 7 years from now. So the Federal Reserve is not exactly Domino's Pizza here. There's, it wouldn't take nearly that amount of time for a normal shipment of gold the size of 300 tons to be moved from New York to Germany. It's just not that difficult. It could clearly be done within a year's time, even with the government doing it. So the idea that they're not repatriating this relatively small amount of gold for 7 years is raising a lot of suspicions on the part of a lot of people that why can't the Fed deliver? It's supposed to have somewhere around 6,000 tons in New York and another roughly the same amount in Fort Knox. So there's supposed to be plenty of gold to make some kind of redemption this size. So it raises a lot of suspicions. There's been rumors, for example, that central banks, including the Fed, have been leasing out their gold holdings to private gold banks. And the gold banks, in turn, take the leased gold and sell it into the marketplace and use the funds that they receive from that to buy bonds in order to earn interest on that transaction so they can pay back the leasing fee to the central bank, which is very small. And then all of the interest from the bonds is a profit to the gold banks. The profit for the Federal Reserve is small in terms of the leasing fee, but in terms of publicity, it suppresses the price of gold. It holds down the price of gold because they're dumping so much gold in a leasing fashion onto the marketplace. So a lot of people have suspected, and there's been rumors to the effect that central banks, including the Federal Reserve, have been leasing their gold in order to suppress gold prices, in order to make their policies look less inflationary. Because, if gold prices, were to go to $3,000 an ounce, everybody would be looking at the Fed saying, what in the world is going on here?
Thanks to everybody who shops at Amazon.com. I wanted to mention that LRC gets a small commission at no cost to the buyer every time you go to Amazon through an LRC link, any of the widgets on the page for books or other items, or entering through the ad at the top left-hand corner of the front page. So thanks again, and it's a huge help. And Amazon, what a great company. It's just extraordinary. You don't need to go down to the local bricks and mortar place. You don't have to pay, in many cases anyway, sales taxes. So far as I can tell, virtually everything the human race produces is for sale at Amazon.com. So I highly recommend it. It helps keep LRC alive and growing. So thanks to all of you who shop at Amazon. I know Ron Paul, ever since the 1970s, has been wanting an audit of the gold at Fort Knox and at the Fed, and also not only to see that there really are not just wooden blocks painted gold or whatever, or gold coated blocks, but that they're who owns it? Who owns the gold? Also, is it coin melt as versus 4.9s, good delivery bars? I mean, all those kinds of questions. And of course, the Fed and the Treasury stonewalled this. And until recently, they got away with it. But now, not only the Central Bank of Germany, but the Bank of Mexico, Bank of Austria. I mean, a lot of these are wanting their gold back. I think it's obviously a tremendous thing just for people to be talking about gold and about central banks and gold. And this is just supposed to be a barbarous relic, wasn't it? I mean, it has no importance. It's just the fiat currencies that count. But obviously, the central banks don't feel that way, and obviously, nor do many other individuals.
Well, it's a change for sure. For a long time, central banks were sellers of gold, and now they've stopped that. And there's a lot of central banks around the world that are adding to their gold holdings. Specifically, China and India have made very large purchases. As a matter of fact, there's some suspicions that China may actually be the second largest holder of gold, which the list is supposed to be the United States, Germany, and China. But people believe that the Chinese have been adding so much gold that they've overtaken the Germans. So that's a sea change in world markets, that central banks have been slowly repatriating some of its gold from New York and elsewhere, but also adding to their gold holdings. So I think that's a sea change in. And one of the things that people are looking in the future for is, the United States has enjoyed a near monopoly dollar as the reserve currency to the world. And so central banks have based their reserves almost solely on U.S. dollars. And everybody now is thinking that that's going to change. The question now is, well, what other country could serve as a reserve currency in competition with the U.S. dollar? And then, of course, the first candidate was the euro. But now people are suspicious that the euro may be totally destabilized and break up. So that's not a very good reserve currency. And the next contender is Chinese money, the Chinese yuan. But that hasn't entered into circulation throughout the world the way the dollar does and the way the German mark did. And so that opens the door that gold may actually reappear as a reserve, one of the fundamental reserves of the central banking system, which I guess is a good thing.
I guess. I mean, it's they can always use it as a trick, but it still is, I think, a good thing to have it discussed. And you're talking about them selling gold. Remember when Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, sold some huge amount of gold at about $300 an ounce? I wish I'd bought some of it, but.
Well, I think he ended up selling more than half of England's or Great Britain's gold supply at what was certainly a very low price, a record low for that time period, certainly. And just as they finished up those sales, of course, the price of gold started to take off, and he cost the Great Britain billions and billions of dollars by doing that.
Remember when Ron Paul was first in Congress, and Henry Royce was famous then as the chairman of the banking committee and Mr. sort of anti-gold. I mean, he hated gold. So the only time I ever saw him just get furious and lose his temper was over the question of he wanted more money for the IMF. And Ron Paul said, well, why don't they just sell their gold? And and he just, didn't answer the question, of course, because he was the guy who said gold means nothing. In fact, he said that the U.S. government was holding the price of gold up at $35 an ounce, and if it ever stopped that, it would plummet far below that. So, but it's funny, they actually realize that it's a huge asset.
Yes.
maybe the only asset.
Yes, that's what happened with the story about the Germans repatriating their gold. All of the commentators, the economists, the mainstream economists said, well, this is all silly, this is all theatrics, this doesn't really mean anything. When in reality, we know those central bankers and people realize that the fundamental value of these monies is psychologically the fact that these central banks hold, a good chunk of the world gold supply, and that there is not a legal backing, but there is a form of psychological backing that gold provides. And so, central bankers and mainstream economists just dismiss gold publicly, but privately they know it's the main thing.
I'll just mention one thing that in thinking about why governments act as they do with things like gold reserves, the U.S. and so forth. In the ancient Athenian Empire, with an empire like the U.S. that denied it was an empire, it was just an alliance of city-states. If you were in quote-unquote alliance with Athens, in other words, controlled by Athens, your city-state had to store its silver reserves, which is what they had in those days rather than gold reserves, in the Parthenon. Because the Greek, the temples were the banks of the time, and the Parthenon was sort of the Athenian state bank, and it was considered an act of war to seek to withdraw your silver reserves.
Yeah, the Fort Knox of its day.
Yeah. So, empires. But Mark, you've written another important article recently about inflation. That got a lot of attention. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, there was discussions on the blogs about Paul Krugman attacking the Austrians because they predicted that CPI would be in double digits by January 1st of 2013. And of course, that didn't happen. And everybody knows that if you increase the money supply, prices are going to rise. The thing that the Austrians add is that we know where the prices are going to rise. And so it's not an attack on Austrian theory of the business cycle that consumer prices didn't rise into double digits yet. Where the money has gone, we look for where the money comes from and where it goes to. And in this case, it's the central bank, the Federal Reserve, who's generating excess credit and putting it through the banking system. And the banks throw that money into financial markets and ultimately in commodity markets. And so when we look around the world, what we find is that there is plenty of price inflation. It's just not in consumer goods yet. We see near record oil prices. We see near record gold prices. We see near record commodity prices in commodity markets. We see rising housing prices and record prices for housing in New York and San Francisco and in Washington, D.C. We see record art auctions in New York City. So the money goes from the Fed to the banks to the hedge funds, and the hedge funds managers are making tons of money. And so when they spend that money, it very often goes into things like the auctions at Christie's and Sotheby's. So we've seen record auctions for contemporary and modern art in terms of the overall size of the value of the auction and in terms of record-setting prices for individual artists. So we can see those, and we see record high levels in the stock market. We see record high levels in bond markets in terms of government bonds, corporate bonds, junk bonds. And so the prices are exploding, and they're exploding for the people who get first access to this money. It's not coming to Main Street yet. The banks are withholding the money in excess reserves, so they're not lending it for your home mortgage or your car loan, which would eventually generate higher consumer goods prices. So the banks are withholding that money, holding it as excess reserves or throwing it into financial markets. And so that we see banks are heavily invested in financial markets and in the stock markets and bond markets. And so it all fits the Austrian pattern very well. And it's not, as Paul Krugman charges, an affront to the Austrian theory of the business cycle in one bit. It's actually the Austrian theory of the business cycle that explains the way prices are right now.
And in fact, if somebody makes a prediction about what the CPI is going to be at a certain point in the future, it has nothing to do with Austrian economics. I mean, a monetarist or anybody can make that sort of a prediction. Austrian economics doesn't tell you what the CPI is going to be in 10 months.
No,
it's not. That's just a personal estimate, or maybe you're a speculator. And some people, of course, are very successful at making those kinds of estimates, make a lot of money from it. But it's a separate area from the Austrian school.
Right. Everybody is, in some sense, agrees with the quantity theory of money that more money equals higher prices. But it's only the Austrians that explain why it's not a level increase in prices across all marketplaces, but that the prices rise in certain markets first, and the money only trickles down to the average person out in Des Moines much, much later when the prices of everything else have increased. So it's the Austrian theory that actually explains exactly what's going on right now and why consumer prices are not as high as some people have speculated.
And even if we look at the great inflation in Weimar and the Weimar Republic in Germany, for a very long time, while they were running the printing presses madly, prices were not going up that much. I mean, it sort of took a while before people psychologically and in other ways understood what the heck was happening, and then prices went up far more than quote unquote they should have by just the quantity theory of money. So yeah, it's a subjective question too.
Yeah, people were puzzled why the German stock market was rising so fast and why nobody could sell bonds, and nobody really understood the situation very well at all until it was really too late. Very often, as Mises pointed out and as Rothbard has pointed out, in the inflationary process, initially the demand to hold money exceeds the new supply of money, so prices don't go up at all. It's only later when the supply of money outstrips the demand for money that prices start to rise, and when people finally view the inflationary process that prices are going to continue to rise forever, they start dumping their money. They reduce their demand for holding dollars or whatever paper currency it is, and as a result of dumping their demand for dollars, then prices really take off. And then it's just a mad scramble to try to get rid of your dollars and try to buy anything at all. Very often when you see these hyperinflations, you'll see that people have started stockpiling all sorts of building supplies and extra cars and all sorts of things, just trying to get out of their local currency and into something that will retain its value.
I was in Argentina in the 1970s, and people were driving to me to a meeting, and we were by this huge building and a gigantic line of women waiting outside of it. And I said, what is that? And they said, well, that's a factory, and the workers are paid twice a day because the money is depreciating so fast. So that their wives wait outside the factory to get the pay envelope, and immediately, of course, go spend it on anything.
Yeah, that's right. The inflationary process is actually always disrupting our way of life. It's only when you get to a hyperinflation that it becomes obvious to everybody that our lives have changed. The way we do things, the way we interact, our business, our labor, all of that is obviously changed in a hyperinflation. But what the Fed is doing right now is actually also changing our life against our will. When we didn't vote for it, it's just something that's being done to us. And so our consumption, our labor, our interaction with people, our investments, all of those activities are being fundamentally altered by the Fed, even though we don't really know it. We don't really see it, but it's there.
Dr. Mark Thornton, thank you for all the good work you do in educating people about what the government and the Fed is doing to us, and this exciting new project you're involved in, all your books and your lectures and interviews, and great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Lew.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.